Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Turvey. I'm President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's J-Talk Live discussion on strategies for combating news avoidance. Our thanks to TD Bank Group, our exclusive J-Talk series sponsor, for making this conversation possible, and our gratitude also extends to our in-kind supporter, Cision. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Toronto, which is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And we are privileged to work and gather in these territories. The discussion today will run for an hour, and we invite you to jump in with questions anytime using the tab on your screen. This marks our final J-Talks Live event of the year. If you missed any of our 2024 talks, you can catch them on our CJF YouTube channel and on our website. We'll be announcing our winter program in the coming weeks through our newsletter and on social media, so be sure to sign up and follow us to stay connected. And as we approach Giving Tuesday, I'd also like to invite you to support the work of the CJF. If you've enjoyed these talks and believe in the importance of fostering excellence in journalism, your donation can help us expand our impact year-round. Thank you for your support and for being part of today's discussion. In an era where access to news has never been more abundant, we face a paradox. More people are choosing to tune out. Around the world, news consumption and interest are declining as news avoidance rises. So how do we address this challenge? How can we as an industry reconnect with disengaged audiences, build trust, and reestablish journalism's role in people's lives? Today, we are fortunate to hear from leading experts in audience engagement, including a valuable perspective from Gen Z or Gen Z, depending on where you are. Together, they'll share practical strategies to tackle this global issue. Joining us from Madrid, where she is Associate Professor of Media and Communications at IE University, Ruth Palmer co-authored the book Avoiding the News: Reluctant Audiences for Journalism, which explains why so many people turn away from news, even in this age of unprecedented access to content. Richard Fletcher is joining us from the UK, where he is the Director of Research at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University, where he works on the Digital News Project and co-authors the Digital News Report, the world's largest annual survey of global news consumption. From here in Toronto, Karen Pugliese is an accomplished journalist and news leader with more than 20 years experience across major newsrooms, including the CBC's investigative unit, APTN, and Canada's National Observer. And joining us from Copenhagen, Mikko Nerviel is here to share his experience from the Global Youth News Lab, where he worked with fellow students at the International People's College to craft an updated version of the Copenhagen News Criteria tailored for Gen Z. From here in Toronto, our moderator, Angela Pacenza, is the Globe and Mail's executive editor, where she leads audience-first journalism and brings her expertise to the CJF board as our vice chair. We're honored to have all of you with us today. Angela, over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Big topic today to get through, and we've got an amazing panel for everyone. So let's get into it. Let's just get going. I'd like to begin by defining the problem that we're trying to solve. And for that, let's go to Richard first. Can you help us define news avoidance and how prevalent it is?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's already been mentioned that one of the main projects that we work on is the Digital News Report, which is our survey of news use and news attitudes across 47 different media markets across the world. Most of those markets that we look at are in Europe, but we also study Latin America, Asia, and also Canada. And we ask a range of different questions in the survey that underpins the report. And many of the trends that we've found over recent years kind of point in the same direction. And I think news avoidance, in a way, sort of sums up some of those trends, I think. So first on definitions, I mean, there are different definitions for news avoidance. People approach it in slightly different ways. In the report, what we do is define it as when people, many of them who are already news users, but they make an active or conscious decision to step back from the news at least some of the time. And since we started tracking this behavior since 2017, the average proportion of people who say that they sometimes or often avoid the news has gone up from 29% to 39%. So that's an increase of 10 percentage points in just 7 years. In Canada, the figures are actually really close to this average. So it was 28% in 2017 and 40% now. So a 12 percentage point increase. And as I said, pretty close to the average we see across all of the different markets that we look at. One of the ways we've tried to sort of go a little bit sort of deeper in our understanding of news avoidance is to separate it into what we've called periodic news avoidance and selective news avoidance. So periodic news avoidance we define as when people try to avoid all news for a particular period of time. So, changing the TV channel if news comes on, scrolling past it on social media, that kind of thing. And this group tends to have slightly lower interest in news than the average population. And then the selective news avoidance, which is a bit different, but I think the difference is important. This is when people decide to avoid specific topics or try to limit their news use to certain times of the day. That kind of more kind of coordinated sort of behavior, and this tends to be something that people with higher levels of interest in news do. When it comes to sort of reasons around news avoidance, three things really stand out. The first is that people think that news in general has a negative effect on their mood, and that's one of the key reasons why they're deciding to step back from it. Another is that sometimes people think it's too focused on politics. Not everyone is interested in politics, and that can be a turn-off for some people. And others just think it's the news is either biased or untrustworthy or something similar to that. So those are the kind of the main ways in which we've tried to study news avoidance over the years.
Okay, great. Thanks, Richard. And Ruth, you spent 4 years, I believe it was, speaking to actual news avoiders for your book. Would love to hear what you found from that work.
Yeah, so actually this was a study that was designed pretty much to complement the Reuters more quantitative work on this topic. Our question was, why do people avoid news? And our goal was to go into a little bit more depth to try to understand that. My book was co-authored with Benjamin Toft, who's now at the University of Minnesota, and Rasmus Nielsen, who's now at the University of Copenhagen. And to try to answer this, we did do these in-depth interviews with consistent news avoiders in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Spain. So it was a comparative study across these nations. And we were focused on, as I said, consistent news avoiders. So these are a group of people that are a little bit different from the people that Richard was talking about. These are people who do not consume really any news at all over a more sustained period of time. And we found that when you ask people to speak in depth about why they avoid news, about their relationship to news, there were two main narratives that emerged. The first, which might kind of surprise people, was the "it's not news, it's me" narrative. So quite a lot of people actually said that there was not a problem with news, but that there was a problem with them. So the most consistent things we heard in this category were either that people said that they were very anxious people, more anxious than average, and that news that they kind of couldn't handle news. And then we also heard from some people that the circumstances of their lives made it difficult to consume news. So for example, like they didn't have time, they were caring for children or loved ones, and news didn't fit into that. But we also heard from a lot of people that it's not me, it's news. So they in fact did blame news and felt that news's deficiencies were the main reason that they didn't consume it. And there we found that the main reasons overlap with those that Richard mentioned. So for example, we heard from many people that news is too negative and depressing, that it is untrustworthy. We heard from many that it was difficult for them to understand. And so here, this may be particular to consistent news avoiders, but many people said, well, I don't consistently consume news. So in the past, when I've wanted to try, I've tuned in and I didn't understand the vocabulary that was being used. I did not understand the protagonists of these stories. So often these are politicians whose names and positions they were not familiar with. We heard from many people that it was repetitive and boring. And finally, perhaps the most consistent thing we were told was that news does not affect me. So in other words, that it's irrelevant to people. And, you know, I'll just make, I think, 3 additional points that come from our data that I think are very important for understanding this phenomenon. The first is that social pressure to consume news is very, very important. So we also interviewed a contrasting group of what we call news lovers. These are people who consistently consume a lot of news. And we found that they tended to belong to multiple overlapping groups, social groups. So family members, professional colleagues, social, you know, interactions that they would have, who put pressure on them to consume news, who really expected them to consume news. People who consistently avoid news usually don't belong to any of those groups. There's no one in their lives that's really expecting them to follow news. So this is very important for helping people to sustain a news habit. The second point is one that Richard also mentioned, which is level of political interest and a sense of political empowerment. We found that people who consistently avoid news tend to have a very low level of political interest, but also tend to feel a very low level of what we call efficacy or kind of power to affect politics. So, you know, whereas I mentioned before that we consistently heard that they said, you know, that they felt the news did not affect them, we also heard them say over and over that they felt they couldn't affect anything that they saw in the news. So it just depressed them and contributed to this feeling of helplessness. My last point is just that we heard from many people that they felt that in the current media environment, there were many more efficient ways for them to find the information they needed. So if a story was big enough and relevant enough to them, the news would find them. This is a concept, this news finds me perspective is something that's been studied by other scholars as well. So through their social networks, that news would get to them. And they said that if there was something specific they wanted to know, they would just Google it. And so accessing news was a very inefficient way for them to find information they felt was very specific and particularly relevant to them. So I think I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you. Some honest feedback that hurts a little bit, but is necessary for this conversation. Miko, let's turn to you. You are a self-described news avoider, but you studied the issue for, I guess it was this high school project that turned into the Global Youth News Lab. Can you tell us a bit about that and tell us the secrets to what Gen Z really wants from the news?
Of course. But first of all, it's just an absolute pleasure to talk about this topic because it was a really interesting workshop that I was a part of. And I would say that I'm not a news avoider anymore. I've developed probably like a reading habit for news after this workshop. And it's called the Global Youth News Lab, and it was a partnership together with News Arcade, whose gamification of news, and as well as the Copenhagen Legacy Lab, where we gathered 70 international students and kind of collaborated with 12 international journalists and helped kind of combat news avoidance and help us understand what kind of news that makes us engage more towards it. And I have some visuals here on the slides for those visual learners. And part of the workshop was first warming up the students and kind of help us define our relationship with news. And the next part was kind of like identify what news we kind of avoid. And it's kind of similar to the pattern that Richard was talking about, like how it's kind of sounds biased news and very one-sided and makes us feel helpless and depressed. That's why we kind of avoid it. And the news that makes us engaging, we identify that something that is more the nice to knows, the need to knows as well, and something that kind of relates to the community that we belong in. And the next part of the workshop was something about the news values that we talked about. And in this breakout room, we kind of talked about which criteria we thought was important for us to kind of help read or makes the news more interesting and readable for us. And at the end, towards the end, we nominated about 7 of these news values, which then turned into the Copenhagen criteria, which is on the next slide. Let's see, yeah. And we decided to keep some of the criteria and I think we added 3 more news values, and I really want to. We highlighted this during the conference at the World News Media Conference in Copenhagen this year, where we talked about the criteria. And I wanted to highlight about empowering news, and that's what we really wanted to see more. That is makes us more engaged towards this. And what is empowering news, you might ask? And it is something more about community representation and something that makes us more feel seen in our own communities. And it all boils down again to constructive journalism. That's what we thought. And I have a little example of what empowering news might look like on the next slide. It doesn't really, it's quite wordy, but I really liked the format of this news. It was giving the background of what it is about, and it was pretty kind of like solution based and very, very forward looking. So it was explaining both the impacts and also the solutions proposed for the news.
Great. That
Yeah,
seems like a worthwhile project you guys worked on.
yeah, it was pretty interesting. It was like all of the students were like didn't even know that they were news avoiders until they knew the term for it. And so it was a really nice project for everyone.
Amazing. Karen, let's jump to you. You've been in the news business both as a journalist and as a news leader. And I'm curious about your work in building an audience. How do you think about finding people who want to follow the news?
I think it's you know, where we're at in the industry is in a time of experimentation. Everybody's aware of this problem and they're trying different things to change it. So one of the things that we've seen develop in Canada is the rise of all these startups. And sometimes they're very specialized startups that are trying to go for a certain audience rather by topic. So it could be, we've seen, I think, the Narwhal and Canada's National Observer, 2 really good examples of going for climate change. We've seen an effort to diversify newsrooms and to reach out to audiences that weren't previously engaged with them. So I'd give the example of CBC Indigenous as an example of that. We've also seen some individuals, and here's where I think we need to really start looking. Because it's a little bit about meeting people where they're at. And I think everybody's kind of referenced that. And I mean that by, on one hand, on the platform, which is rife with some problems, but also just where they're at in terms of what's been said about the news being inaccessible to people. So I'll talk a little bit about the platform and meeting people where they're at, and then I'll talk a little bit about accessibility. So I kind of wanted to give a shout out a little bit to Rachel Gilmore, who's a young Canadian journalist who's gone on to TikTok. And she has almost 100,000 followers. And she very simply goes on and uses the format at TikTok. Has been quite successful with it. And what she does is she does a lot of explainers. So here you've got somebody who's developing a one-on-one relationship with their audience, doing explainers and making things that might be sweeping past people accessible to them, and is also just like taking a format where that people are using and you know, and kind of mimicking some of the trends on it, the way she does things. And so when they come across her, the format's familiar. So I think all of those things have really helped her to build an audience. What I'll say about the trouble with platforms and news right now is it's very different from when we worked in Cablevision and it was just beamed into people's homes and they either looked at the channel and liked it or didn't, because we've got a curator in between us. And that can be TikTok, it can be Twitter, it used to be Facebook, but you no longer have people who are just looking and seeing like having an even equal chance of picking what is served up. There is someone in between who, through algorithms, are manipulating things. And it's had a huge effect on the news industry because we are now writing often for those algorithms. We've seen a rise in people writing things that are more emotive, more passionate, perhaps more angry. We know that if we do opinion pieces that push people's buttons, that it's going to get people coming to our platforms. And this isn't necessarily an organic relationship. It's being manipulated by the algorithms in between, which are rewarding those and serving them up. So it's something that we have to figure out how to get around, because it's not actually a natural relationship in between what the audience is interested in and what we're serving. There's somebody in between who's pressing the buttons or manipulating the relationship. I think one of the other things, just in terms of trust in the audience, is that we have to really rethink how we're doing things, and we might just be doing them wrong. I think a lot about political shows. And when I was a cub journalist in at APTN, Dan David, our news director, said we were absolutely not to go up to the Hill the first year. And he said, what happens up there spins above people. It's not really engaged with people. The meat of the political stories are actually out in the community. And when we had like 3 elections in a row, because that was the series of minority governments with Martin up until Kretschmer, Martin, Harper. So we were changing governments every 2 years there for a while. So we did a lot of election coverage. And instead of getting on the bus and following the leaders, who practically never went into Indigenous communities, we went into Indigenous communities. Instead of looking at the platforms of what the parties were offering, we went into communities and asked, what do you need? And brought those questions to the leadership that otherwise weren't making the news cycle. I do know that after the 2016 election, I was lucky to be able to have a conversation with some of the people at the New York Times, and they were talking about how they felt they had covered the election wrong. And one of the things that they needed was more boots on the ground. And I thought, oh, well, that's exactly what Dan told us to do at APTN. So I think some of what we've heard about news you can use, news being useful to people, we actually have to be out there in the communities serving the public. Not stuck on our television show with politicians coming in one after the other and having this conversation that looks really good between us and them, but is completely irrelevant to what people are living in their everyday lives.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely going into communities is one way we can combat. I also hear that positive or uplifting news, maybe to Miko's point about empowering news is successful or works. Have any of you seen that working, and how do you do it well? I don't know if Ruth or Richard want to jump in.
Well, I mean, we have we sort of tried to collect data on these issues, and that's obviously not the same as coming up with a solution that actually works, but it may be sort of points in certain in certain directions to suggest certain things. So when for example, we've asked people in our survey, what kinds of news formats or news topics they're most interested in, and then we split the data by news avoiders, compared to news users, then we do see some differences, and we do see that news avoiders do say that they're more interested in, for example, positive news stories, solutions journalism, and explainers, which aligns with what we've just heard, I think. And also at the same time, the news avoiders group say that they're less interested in the kind of big stories of the day. And I think one of the ways that I think about this is that if you think about sort of positive stories, solutions journalism, explainers, these are, in a sense, I think what holds them together is that they're in some way kind of linked to kind of personal enjoyment or personal development. Whereas if you think about kind of the big stories of the day, if people pay attention to those, it's probably, as much to do with sort of kind of a sense of civic duty to sort of, feel as a citizen, you should know what's going on in the world. And I think in a way, news avoidance, is sort of tracking the sort of perhaps the decline of that kind of view, and that sort of kind of driving force for sort of staying in touch with the news. So I think maybe I said the data sort of does sort of point us in that direction. I think also on sort of positive news, I think that's the one that I sort of struggle to think about the most, perhaps, because I think in some ways I think sort of news can't always be positive. But at the same time, perhaps, if you think about the people's relationship with entertainment consumption, it's something they look forward to. It's something they really feel like they get something from. And perhaps if news was a bit more that, like something that people actually look forward to doing rather than doing it on autopilot, people perhaps would, be less likely to become news avoiders, because they don't feel like they need to sort of take control of something they're doing without really sort of thinking. So I think there's a lot of potential with something like positive news, but I think it's hard to think through how this might work in practice.
Yeah, because I think if as a journalist you're creating this type of content, and you feel like, okay, we're trying to address all of these things, but how do you actually get it in front of those people who actively, either deleted their apps or are not looking at it? Ruth, did you come across anything
Yeah,
in
so
talking to people?
I have a few thoughts about this. I agree with your last point very much. So, especially when it comes to consistent news avoiders. Right now, I think actually a lot of news organizations are experimenting with different ways to make news happier, for example, or different types of explainers that are aimed at people who haven't necessarily been following the news consistently. But the people that we interview for our book, they don't know about any of that. And that's a big problem. So I think when we talk about solutions, we need to think not only of ways that we can present the news differently, different kinds of content, but also how those efforts can be publicized, so that more people find out about them, especially these people that we're trying to attract, but who are not going to find out about them because they don't tune into news. And in terms of how to make it more positive, this is something that is we hear so consistently from news avoiders, and their complaint is not that I mean, I don't think anyone argues that all news should be positive. In fact, for a lot of people, that wouldn't feel like news. So there's research that finds that people don't think that really happy news is really news. It doesn't seem newsy to them. So I think that the goal would be the goal would be for news to not feel so relentlessly negative. Right. So there are a couple of ways that this could be approached. One is through tone. So a lot of people we talked to felt that the tone tends to be very scaremongery. This was a complaint we heard particularly in the UK, actually. So there's tone, but there's also the possibility for interspersing more positive stories. And I think here there's a lot of overlap actually with a lot of the other things we've said. So more community-oriented stories often tend to be more positive. They just do. Stories that are more empowering to people, that talk about not just solutions, but specific actions that individuals can take. Often those feel more positive to people. So here I think, it is kind of a matter of expanding our very definition of news in some ways, to include some of these other things, because I think, we tend to define news around issues of conflict and negativity without even necessarily realizing we're doing that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's also, I think sometimes when we're in the news business, there's multiple wars going on, there's elections, and I think it feels relentless also on the journalists that are covering it. Miko, would love to hear from you. Other than TikTok, what would it take to get you and your friends, like, does changing the tone of our stories help?
Yeah.
Does the mix help? What would it take?
Yeah, I thought about this. So like empowering news is one thing, but like getting news from somewhere else is another thing. Like I feel like I need to constantly search for or need to look for news. It feels like a civil duty that I should be reading what the journalists write. And so if it was like formatted in some way that it can kind of like seamlessly bump into our like For You pages, not just TikTok, but also social media websites, where you kind of like don't feel that it is that you don't feel that it's kind of a priority in some sort of way, because like in these TikTok videos you release kind of like those high levels of dopamine levels, and you can't really get that from reading the news. And so if it is reformatted in some type of social media medium, or because everyone has access to their phones nowadays, and just not having to search it up, and just would be greatly beneficial for especially for the younger generations, I would say. But I'm not particularly sure if it would work for more mature audiences.
And that is one of the challenges is newsrooms and news outlets, I think, need to make decisions about which audiences are we doing these things for, and different audiences do consume them differently.
Yeah.
Karen,
Because
what?
yeah, because we did find it a little bit like outdated and in a sense kind of too traditional and breaking news-y background music with too much like alarming sounds, and that's just doesn't work for us, I would say.
For sure.
Yeah.
Karen, what do you make of that? Like, how do you try to satisfy two types of audiences who have very different consumption habits?
Yeah, well, I think there's just so many more than two types of audiences. But
Fair.
I know what you mean. And I think, some of what I'm hearing, like Ruth had referenced, and this is what I was thinking too, like, what do you do with war? We've got two major wars going on right now, Israel, Palestine, and Russia, the Ukraine. But I know that when I was at CBC and we were starting to watch, like we were watching the audience and saying, when is going to be the tipping point where they've had enough of Russia and the Ukraine? Will it be a week? Will it be 2 weeks? And then what do you do? Because do you stop covering something because it's not popular? And that's really the struggle in between news and ratings right now. Because ratings are just so much more important than they used to be when news was a habit, and maybe you got the newspaper and you didn't read it that day. But now, like you really, especially for some of the people who are really subscription based, because we've lost our advertising base in news. And so I noticed that I wasn't working on the national, but I noticed that where they were kind of guiding things were more and more towards the human stories and sort of those human spirit stories. So we saw like a young kid going and playing their violin in the ruins. And it gave you a little slice of life piece that was just, heartrending, hopeful, emotional, but also gave you context in which to speak about the war. And I've noticed the rise also in podcasting, where it's much more storytelling. Like there's two types of podcasts. There's one where people just kind of chat. And then there's the other ones where people go out and build up these documentaries. And you can think of the highly successful ones like Connie Walker's, for example, which had a lot of ratings and unfortunately got canceled because Gimlet decided just to cancel it despite the fact it was doing so well. But I've been listening to This American Life lately, and I think it's really, I encourage people to tune in if you haven't tuned into that for a while and tune back. Because This American Life was very human stories that were very much, might be a day-to-day story about a time you went on a boating trip and something weird happened, or your painful relationships between parents or children, just these slice of life pieces. But they've really stepped up, I'd say, in the past months to looking at harder news stories, but told in very engaging ways that really put you in touch with the people. So they were covering a couple who were trying to get out of Gaza. And it was just like an absolutely riveting story. They've been covering, the election and who voted for Trump, and but in a way that is really engaged with people. And so they've got a very strong narrative. So to what people were saying about like sort of the medium, like if you can't do solutions journalism, the other thing you can do is just make your writing very compelling. I'll say the other thing that I was recently at the Press Forward conference where a lot of the startups get together and talk about strategies. And the narwhal was talking about posting multiple versions of a story. So here you go for the different audiences. What about the audiences that just want the news and want the quick hit? Because the narwhal is known for doing very beautiful, long stories with great images and everything. And for people who are heavy news consumers like myself, that's great. Well, if you're a journalist, you really love to dig in and read that because you admire the craft. But some people just want the news. So they're putting out short versions of that and breaking them up into like multiple stories. So you can go and you can get like the quick hit of news and not have to engage for a very long time with it, but know what's going on as well. So doing those multiple versions of stories, along with strong narratives, and when you can, solution journalism. What I will say, one thing about solution journalism that I do have a bit of a problem with is when taken to the extreme, it's very possible to create false hope stories. And we've got to be very careful about that we're not just looking for the happy ending or the high note at the end, or bringing somebody on who is going to say something that sounds like a solution that's not tried or tested. I always am a little bit caution about trying to make something solution oriented, but perhaps creating false hope if you don't really have something that's a true solution. Oh, I think you're muted.
I did the thing. I did the thing. One person always has to do it. We are getting a lot of audience questions, so I'm going to jump to some audience questions and then pick up on a few more threads. We have one question from Nicolette who, and we started to touch on this, but do you think news media in Canada has a PR problem? Or I guess we could say news media anywhere, really. Do we have a PR problem? Who wants to take it?
I feel like I just had this experience, when I was at CNO, that yes, I think that in some ways, part of the reason that I feel like we're losing trust is that we're sometimes just not engaging or educating or responding to our audience, and there's got to be a better way to do it. But there was a point where I'd written an article and I was doing like analysis there. And so one of the few things that you can actually advocate for if you're a journalist is freedom of the press. And so this was a point where Pierre Poilievre had called a press conference and then wasn't allowing questions. And a reporter from the Globe just absolutely went after him and wouldn't let him talk till he agreed that there would be questions at the end. And so I just got my email box full after I wrote a critical piece on Pierre Poilievre for taking that stance in the first place. And it was a lot from conservatives, and some of them weren't polite. They're calling me a liberal mouthpiece, and that was the most polite thing that they called me. But my publisher there, Linda, she was always very careful to say, if you respond to somebody, be kind. And I decided to do this experiment where I would just respond and explain myself and why I took that position to every single person that wrote into me. And like I said, there's like 500 emails. It took me like 2 days. And a lot of the people who'd been very agitated and angry at me actually wrote back and responded, I didn't think that I'd get a response. I'm not used to getting like somebody actually writing me back when I write to the newsroom. And I think that, like, is it possible that we give off the image that we think we're better than the audience? I wonder if that's part of the problem.
Ruth is nodding her head, I'm afraid to know.
Yeah, well, I have a couple of thoughts about this. One is that I think I've done past research about people who have appeared in news stories. And that was actually one of the major findings from my previous book, which is called Becoming the News, was that in fact, people did have a very strong sense that journalists thought that they were better than other people. But to this question about whether journalism has a PR problem, I can't speak to this problem in Canada specifically, but one of the things we find in our book is that journalism, at least in the countries that we studied, which are 3 very different countries, so there's a strong chance that this is much more widespread. Part of the problem is that people have strong beliefs about journalism, what we call folk theories, and these do not only come from their direct experience with news. They circulate widely in society. We're exposed to them. So these are fed in some ways and crafted by, for example, political figures who have a lot at stake here and benefit from people having negative ideas about news. They're ideas that circulate on social media. And so this negative view that people have of journalism isn't necessarily, it's just not entirely because journalism is doing the wrong thing. It may be partly due to that. But the belief that you simply can't trust it and that you would be foolish to trust any news, that's a widespread belief. And it doesn't come just from people's direct experience with news. So what this means is that it's actually very difficult to turn around these beliefs just by changing journalism. And that's a very big challenge here, I think.
Absolutely.
I agree with that, and I think the data that we've collected sort of definitely sort of points in that direction. So in that sense, journalism does have a sort of PR problem when it comes to things like trust, perceptions of bias, and so on. But I think there's another way in which it perhaps also has a PR problem as well, and that is, I think it's often not clear to people why they should consume the news or why it's worth their time to consume the news. And I think there is perhaps a bit more room for news organizations and other organizations that are interested in similar things to kind of promote the idea of news, not just because it's good for society, but it could be a good way for individuals to spend their time. And I think it could be kind of sold in that way to people a little bit more strongly. So I think that there's definitely more that could be done, I think, in that regard.
Great, thank you. We've got a question for Ruth from Vern. Did you observe that there were periodic increases or decreases in news consumption driven by major events? For example, leading up to an election, after a natural disaster, or the start of a war?
That's an interesting question, and our data isn't very good at responding to it, really, because for most people, we did these one-off interviews. So we were interviewing them at one point in time, but we did return to some of our interviewees at key moments to ask them if they had changed their habits. So we did this in the UK and in the US. And some people had actually changed their news habits around the time of when COVID, for example, was very new. We went back and asked people if they had changed their news habits. And at the beginning of that, they had. There's other research that also found, of course, that at the beginning of COVID, people consumed more news, but then they tended to drop off. So really, I would say in a lot of ways, our data is not very good at answering that question. I will say that in all three countries where we did these interviews, we intentionally did them with news avoiders around the times of important elections. So in Spain, there was an important independence vote in Catalonia, which was covered very heavily in the news. In the UK, it was soon after the Brexit vote. In the US, it was around the time of the primaries leading up to the election in 2020. And we chose to do that specifically because we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to talk to people who are avoiding the news, even though there are these huge issues in the news, and in fact they were. So I'm not sure that really answers the question, but again, our data doesn't really speak to that very well.
Okay. Another question here from Ira. I've been a news junkie most of my life, but over the past year or so, I find much of the news leaves me feeling some combination of sad, mad, or bad, which we have talked about. Sorry, I'm just reading the rest of the question. Isn't news avoidance a pretty rational response to what's going on in the world today?
I mean, I think in some ways, yes. I mean, I think we've been collecting the data on news avoidance on our project since 2017, and we've seen an increase in that time. But of course, a large part of that period has been kind of dominated by events that are really sort of difficult for people to sort of kind of engage with, but for all the reasons that we've talked about. So it may be, I don't think it is just this, but it may be that a sort of a sort of sizable sort of part of the sort of the increase in news avoidance is driven just by the news cycle, which may not stay the same in the future. But I do think underneath that there are also kind of sort of deeper changes to the public's relationship with news. Just one other point on whether it's rational. I think it really depends on what people want from the news media. If they want to have a kind of basic understanding of what's going on around them, they don't need to necessarily spend sort of hours a day consuming news. You can do that, and you can feel informed, you can feel satisfied by your knowledge of what's going on, but with a fairly small amount of news consumption. So I think in that sense you could see it as a rational choice. And then the question perhaps becomes, well, why do some people spend so long engaging with the news, about things that aren't really connected to them, that are happening far away, and their news consumption isn't going to really change their relationship to those events.
I can add a little bit to that. I agree with all of that, and would just say that in the news avoidance research, there's a fairly consistent sort of thread in the qualitative research or the interviews with people who selectively or periodically avoid the news. So these are people who do consume news, but they sometimes turn away because they feel usually overwhelmed or for other reasons. And they do tend to say that doing that helps them conserve energy and emotional energy so that they can consistently consume news over time. So taking these breaks actually can be good for news consumption in the longer term. So that's what people say anyway. They do feel better when they're not necessarily consuming news quite so consistently. So perhaps, there is some truth to this. Again, I think this is a folk theory, but there's some truth for a lot of people to the idea that that selectively avoiding news may actually make them feel better, but just that they, again, engage, right?
Yeah, I just want to say, Ruth, that's exactly what I do. Like as a journalist, I work in news, but every now and then I need a break. And it's exactly that. I need a break so I can energize myself and work myself up for it again, because I do want to know what's going on. But sometimes you just need a break.
Yeah. Just want to shift a little bit. So here I am, I'm a news leader in Canada, in a newsroom. What is one thing I can start tomorrow? Miko, do you want to maybe take this first? What is something that I can start tomorrow and try to engage staff to do journalism differently?
Sorry, what was the question?
It's okay. Just in speaking about news avoidance, what is something, if tomorrow I wanted to start something to try to combat news avoidance, what is one thing that you would advise or you would like to see?
Yeah, well, actually, from a Gen Z perspective, I wouldn't necessarily say that we are always combating news. I would say that we're pretty much so aware of like the things that are happening in the world, and it's all just um in a different format. So, like for example, I would just like speak to or like take a video of myself and rant about the current election and how stupid the president is, and that's kind of like in a way um, 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 something I would probably consume and kind of like place my rage because someone is speaking my thoughts for myself. Um, and so if I would start tomorrow, then it's probably just reformatting the whole maybe media industry, which is quite provoking. But as I said, I haven't seen televised news in probably 5 years.
Good reality to let sink in.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
No, it's
Yeah.
good. It's important. That's why we're having this conversation. Karen, what about you? If there was one thing that I should start tomorrow, what do you think it would be?
Well, one of the pieces of advice that I gave to the newsroom when I was at APTN, because I found sometimes that we do get caught up in things, right? And we start picking up the language of politicians or bureaucrats and stuff. And it really is gobbledygook. And so sometimes I'd be vetting something. I'd go, what does this even mean? And the reporter would have a hard time explaining it to me. I said, well, listen, if you can't understand it, a person at home is not going to understand it because it's not their job. They don't have 8 hours a day to engage with this stuff and figure it out. So we've got to figure it out. And I'd sometimes encounter this resistance because people would think that they would say, well, you're asking me to dumb something down. And I said, well, it's not, you can't think of it as disrespectful. You've got to think as if you're walking into your auntie's room out on the res. And if you don't have an auntie on the res, but you have an auntie that lives somewhere else, then you can think of that too. But somebody who's older, but who's not engaged, but that you respect, and you want to tell them something really important happened today. And here's what it is. And how would you have that very conversationally with them? And I think that's one thing to get away with. But I also, Miko said something that was really interesting that I think is an upcoming trend in journalism that, older journalists like myself are trying to bend our hands around and not very comfortable with, is that it's not always expected to do straight news anymore. And people don't think there's been so much talk about objectivity, and that's a whole other session to do. But I think transparency is something that people really want. And people get very engaged when on one hand you do straight news, but on the other hand, you do some analysis or some opinion work, and they get a feel for who you are and how you're processing things. And that's demand that we get very uncomfortable with as journalists, because we have to be one or the other. We feel that if we step in and start doing analysis or giving opinion, that we're now giving bias. But what if that's giving transparency? So I think that's something that I don't know how to navigate yet, but I understand that the demand is out there, and I'm starting to understand why.
Yeah, it's a good point, because newsroom culture and the way that I think some of us have been brought up is so different than today. So thank you. Ruth, one thing that I can do tomorrow?
Yeah, so from our research, one of the most consistent things we found was that people said that they felt that news didn't affect them. So I would say that really the goal for almost every story should be to make that very clear. And here again, I think unfortunately we have the problem that it can be difficult to do that without feeling like you're compromising objectivity, right? So especially if it's a policy thing that is very politicized, how do you explain to people the effects of this policy without, appearing to some sort of take sides? Often there are, political figures that argue that the effects will be different, but nonetheless, this is really important because people seek out information that they think will affect them directly. And they say that news doesn't. So if it were much more clear to people, and this is particularly true, I think, for political stories, the way that politics is so often covered focuses on, of course, there's been much said about this, the horse race, or that, politicians infighting. And that is the way that news avoiders often perceive it. But if political news in particular could be told in a way that made it clear that this actually is about your problems, I think that would really change the level of interest in a big way.
Yeah, and I think we saw, quite a bit of that since Trump announced the 25% tariffs. We saw a lot of sort of explainers of how this will affect your pocketbook. And those stories tend to do better than even the original news hit, because it is about someone, the individual. Richard, anything you want to?
This overlaps with what Karen said, but I think of the sort of three kinds of sort of format or types of journalism that news avoiders say they're most interested in: positive, solutions, and explainers. I think explainers, this is in a way it's the most obvious one, or the sort of the most straightforward one to actually sort of execute, because we kind of know what it looks like, and there are already some really good examples of not just news organizations, but individuals on social media who are very engaging to young people through doing news explainers. Some of these are very popular. And also, the BBC, for example, has a sort of good sort of explainer sort of series. So I think we kind of know what the successful version of that looks like, and it seems to be working. So I think that is obviously, it's not something you can do by itself. I don't think it has to be alongside other things, but I think this to me seems like a promising avenue, and one that could sort of get started on straight away.
Thank you. We have time for at least one more audience question, so I'm gonna jump to one that Raphael asks. This idea of offering ideas as to what people can do about the issue in the article. How can we reconcile that with the neutral position of the journalist? For example, as a science journalist, if I write a story on plastic pollution, I talk with chemists researching new methods of recycling plastic. But should I also be including a sidebar telling my readers not to buy Ziploc bags or to email their elected officials? So this sort of speaks to the role of advocacy and the line blurring. Karen, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. I remember, like there's both sidism, which is a very bad thing that we have to avoid. And there was such a good climate example when every time we talked about, is climate change happening, we'd run out and find, dig up somebody who said that it wasn't, so that we could have that balance. And eventually there was a big conference of scientists from around the world that got together and said, look, 90% of us believe in climate change, and you journalists have got to stop doing this and running out and because you're portraying as if it's a 50-50 balance, and it's not. So I think if we kind of expand on that idea and apply it to journalism throughout, I think it's the transparency of, do we have the space in journalism to find a way to explain why we do journalism the way we do, why we're talking to people who we're talking to, and what the, like, just even putting in a line like that, the reason that we don't go running to the other side, or the reason that we're not talking about this, is because the majority of scientists don't think it's relevant. They think that this is relevant. I think some of that in the political sphere as well could be helpful, to the point that Ruth raised about, here's what the politician wants you to think. Why are we saying something different? Because we're bringing in experts, and we just can't find experts to back up the opinion that this is going to unfold the way this politician is telling it.
Anyone else want to jump in? Ruth, you're nodding your head.
I mean, I agree that this is one of those areas where it's very difficult, because it seems like the way that we've done this traditionally has allowed us to, both avoid telling people what to do or giving people ideas about taking action, but also avoid accusations of advocacy, right? So this, again, is one of those areas where we have to think about kind of redefining the way we've always done things. I think Karen's suggestions are great, being very transparent about why these are the recommendations. But to the questioner's question, yes, I mean, I think that would be that with his suggestion of actually having kind of a sidebar saying these are the things you should do. That's what we have been told, as people researching news avoidance, people seem to want. So I think it would look something like that, in fact.
Okay, so next year at this time, we'll all come back together. We're all going to be doing explainers, changing our tone, multiple formats, and then Miko will be reading all of our content all of the time. Is that what I'm hearing? Okay, well, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today, and to our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much for your insights. I think I've got a lot of takeaways to try in our newsroom, and I hope others do as well. Definitely not a topic that we've exhausted. I think there's so much more to discuss in this. And yeah, thank you everyone for watching, and thank you CJF for putting on these J Talks.